2 weeks off, and we're back. Back in business. Welcome to High Quality Podcast Action. I'm Nick. That's John. Um,
Hey.
so last week, obviously, we had to take some time off. We just didn't have time to record a podcast.
As
Um,
busy men
right.
do.
My reason is very simple. Okay, the Overwatch Halloween event started, and all I've been doing is playing that. I just can't stop. Once I started, I couldn't stop. I just kept going. I need those Halloween loot boxes. It's just driving me nuts. They're not even loot boxes. They're jack lanterns. They got rid of the
There
loot
is such a
boxes. They're
thing as
jack
gaming
lanterns.
addiction, folks, and Nick has one.
No, I don't. No, I don't. I may be twitching right now.
I can't tell.
No,
I don't have video feed.
Well, what were you up to on this brief hiatus?
I was working on studying for my quantum mechanics exam in between trips to Los Angeles, and now this week going on another trip tomorrow evening that I still haven't packed for, but
Yikes.
shuttling around.
Well, you have an actual excuse. I just came up with one.
Yeah, well,
I think I've played Overwatch like an hour the past
I
3 weeks.
I haven't played Overwatch. I've played Overwatch less than that in the last month, easily.
It's a pretty fun game now and
Yeah.
again.
It's entertaining, but
That's right.
just haven't gotten around to it
No.
at all.
You know,
Really?
what have you gotten around to? I bet there's something you gotten around to right now.
What have I gotten around to right now?
Yeah.
Is this a leading question?
But your beer. The
Oh,
beer. Yeah, what did you think I was talking about?
I mean, I figured, but I didn't want to be presumptuous.
Oh, come on. I set that up perfectly. Now we're going to look stupid.
So my beer. I just had my first sip because it was a little heady,
Slacking.
and you can't rush good beer. That much is true. Anyway, it's a beer today
Oh, that's
from
good.
Maine, of all
Maine.
places.
They have a beer up there? I guess there's not really much else to do except catch lobster and drink.
Yeah,
Could
it
be
is
wrong.
beautiful, but I haven't been. I just have a lot of coworkers and coworkers who have been to Maine on vacations, and then one coworker who is from Maine originally. But from Peak Organic Brewing Company, which has fantastic packaging, I must say, very modern and very simplistic compared to some other cans that I've seen. But
This is just a white
simple-
label that says beer on it in block
No,
lettering.
honestly, if I could find a company that made, and I feel like I might have seen it before, what I'm thinking of, but just a company that had a can of beer that literally just said beer by brewing company on it, I would buy that shit in a heartbeat.
Doesn't sound suspicious at all. Anyway.
No, not at all. And if it was, in just like a really innocuous can, if it didn't even have a label on it, really, if it was just the silver of an aluminum can and embossed
So
Or-
it was just the raw aluminum can and just like embossed the word beer brewing company on it.
or screen printed or something that just looks really good quality, but nothing that would imbue a sense of supreme quality or anything. No marketing
No high
oversight
quality.
in that.
It's not
No.
high quality.
But if the beer was high quality, then, hey, that's all that really matters.
Well, why don't you explain how high quality the main beer is?
It's not bad, honestly. It's the Autumn IPA, a session IPA for all, as the packaging implies.
Mm-hmm.
But
Only in
it's
autumn.
pretty
It's pretty.
pretty solid IPA.
Okay.
Had to take a second drink.
Are you
Can't just go
drinking?
off one drink.
Are you drinking it too fast?
No,
Okay. Good.
never drink beer too
Good.
fast. I'm an experienced. Fuck, I don't remember what the sommelier equivalent of a beer drinker is
I don't
off the
know.
top of my head.
I don't think there's any way to make that sound good.
No, but
Enthusiast? I don't know.
there's an actual name for it. I'm gonna look that up. Beer sommelier. I'm gonna mispronounce the shit out of this. Cicerone.
Chicharron?
Cicerone.
Chicharron? Like
Cicerone.
I thought you meant chicharron. I was like, I don't think that's what that is.
No. That's why I figure I probably butchered the crap out of that. But
That's all right.
in any event,
That's
beer
all
is
right.
it's a pretty reasonable session IPA. A little stronger. The session implying that it's a little bit stronger or more. I guess most people would identify it as more hoppy than your standard IPA, but not necessarily being a double IPA or like an imperial IPA where you've got really ridiculously strong hops and alcohol. And it looks like it's unfiltered. Maybe it's not, but it's definitely pretty cloudy. That could just be the fact that it's being brewed in the Northeast.
So
And
what else is in it? Like, I know some IPAs do fruity stuff in it. Since it's fall, what's happening in it?
I think it's just an IPA that
Really?
they happen to call an autumn IPA.
What the fuck, man?
I don't know.
What does it matter with that state?
They're secluded from the rest of us. They're kind of an odd group.
Uh-huh. Okay. Maybe that explains Susan Collins. I don't know.
That could be. Though we don't need to get into that this week. I don't feel like.
So we're just avoiding politics this week. I did no political preparation. We're going in circles here. We're just, every time Trump says something stupid or does something obviously stupid, like obviously stuff has happened with the, journalist who pretty obviously right now was murdered by Saudi Arabia and or Turkey.
Mm-hmm.
Or, Mitch McConnell coming out and saying that, flat out just saying that it's Social Security and Medicare is the reason for the deficit and not the tax care plan. So we don't have a whole lot. At least I don't have a whole lot to add to any of that. Because there's not much to say about that.
Yeah, the only thing I would probably say with regard to politics or the political segment of this podcast is that elections are coming up in what, 3 weeks?
Not
Almost to the date.
3 weeks from yesterday. So
yeah. So if you haven't registered to vote, that should be finishing up probably this week in some states. I know the deadline was last week for New York, but you should be registered to vote and you should be going to vote because it's important.
And I'm just gonna come out and say it because some of us are thinking it. Okay, and it's
Okay.
unfortunate that we reached this point, but it's pretty much a vote Democrat or enable Trump some more. That's pretty much what it's down to. Because if Republicans keep a majority in Congress, they're gonna continue doing what they're doing, and maybe even at a faster rate. Because we already know what the plan is. So unless you're just oblivious or don't care or just really hard-headed, like I just don't see a reason to not vote or to vote Republican. That's where we're at right now. I'm not saying that anyone is perfect. I mean, if you watch that video that Obama made, he summarizes it perfectly. I didn't write down what he said, but go watch it for yourself. ATTN made that video. It's worth the watch. The man is an amazing orator, unlike his replacement. Successor. That's a better word. Yeah, that's how it is right now. I'm sorry that we've reached this point, but it's what has to be done right now.
It is what it is.
Yeah.
And on that note, although I would like to go into a deeper discussion at some point about some of the things like how do we solve an issue when, or how do we solve the issue of the extremely entrenched Republican camp just trying to only have their way be the way that things work and not really agreeing to any kind of or any sort of compromise.
The
Sort of
better
the same
question is
thing
that
for-
possible?
Yeah, is it possible, and how do we go about enacting that? But with an eye toward that eventual discussion, for anybody who enjoys reading a book on the subject,
Oh,
I
yes, do
believe
tell.
I've mentioned this before
I think I know what it is, but yeah.
on the podcast. It's a book written by Thomas E. Mann and Norman J. Ornstein, who are two past political analysts who, as most political analysts usually are, unless they work for Fox News or someone who is very pointedly on one side of the aisle or the other, try to be as unbiased as they can throughout their careers, took the opportunity to write a book called It's Even Worse Than It Looks, and an updated version of It's Even Worse Than It Was, which is about how the American constitutional system collided with politics of extremism, those being only on the Republican side of things. And I think it does a fantastic job. Both of the books do a good job, although the most updated of the two, It's Even Worse Than It Was. They may have even written a new one. I haven't checked, because this book, It's Even Worse Than It Was written before Donald Trump was elected president. So there are
So
a
it
few
needed
things
an
in there
updating.
that probably have been warranting adjustment, but
Yeah.
the same idea behind, or the premise behind, the material is very much the same, and it does a very good job of breaking down why things have become the way they are, and even goes into some ideas for fixing the party system and learning how to navigate the system that exists as it did in 2014, 2016, and now leading up to today. Gives a little bit of a few pointers on how to navigate that system, which honestly it could probably represent a whole podcast, not just
Mhm.
a half of one or a part of one, with the amount of material that they engage in. But one of the things in here, as I had thumbed through it earlier, I did find some underlined passages from my first reading of the book that stuck out to me about how to fix the party system, and their first note on how to go about fixing the current state of the party system divide in Congress and the Senate is to moderate politics by expanding the electorate, i.e., more people need to vote.
Mandatory voting. Don't they have that in
Oh, yeah.
Australia? Some countries do actually have that. And they also have voting days a national holiday or on a weekend. There's a start.
That would be one possibility. But as we said, not this week for politics.
No.
So what are we going to talk about this week, Nick?
Well, over this weekend, I took a trip.
You did?
Yeah.
Where to?
To New York City.
Ooh.
Saw some college friends there. Had a good time.
Yeah.
But
Anything else going on there that you did?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Not just eating, which did a fair amount of.
As you do.
Yes. Had some of that, New York bread. The water does make a difference.
It does.
Yes.
I can attest to that.
It is scientific proof that water does make a difference in the taste of bread.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, so...
Which is interesting, just from a civil engineering point of view. New York City's water all comes from upstate, except it travels hundreds of miles in pipes So I wonder if the piping has an effect on the overall taste of it.
Could be. So I was there for about a day and a half. Probably, if I add up the hours, it was just a day.
Yeah.
So I didn't get to do everything I wanted, but went downtown, saw the World Trade Center Memorial, walked around Times Square at night, which is way better than at night when all the screens are lit up.
Yeah.
Basically, just walked around that area and saw, Broadway, places like that. Did not see a Broadway show because I do not have the money. Anyway.
Yeah. There are means to see shows, but it involves standing in will call lines for a while to see if you get lucky.
No thanks.
Yeah.
Anyway. Then the following day, I went to the Natural History Museum, the American Natural History Museum. And the way I like, not only like it's a really big building, but the way it's organized is pretty neat too. Unfortunately, some of the exhibits were closed, like the Hall of Gems. And geological samples, couldn't go and see that, unfortunately. Some people are like, what do you mean, unfortunately? It sounds boring as hell. And to people who think that, fuck you. Anyway. So exhibit, the exhibit I found.
Very pointed statement there.
Yeah, sorry. I gotta express myself. The exhibit I found most interesting is the, exhibit that has all the fossils. And the way that it's organized is chronologically. So, the earliest specimens they have to the most recent stuff.
Sure.
But at each point, they point out why speciation occurred. Like, what evolutionary change happened here that made this a different species versus the specimen next to it. And what I found interesting was how minor some of these changes were. Like something you wouldn't think of as being like warranting a new species, like losing tooth enamel was the one. I was like, that's it. And then there's some ones that are major, like eye sockets moving from the back of the skull to more the front of the skull. And the placenta was one of the big branching moments.
Of course it was.
Yeah. And apparently, a lot of people don't know this. Placenta actually started in eggs before, mammals were making their way into the animal kingdom. So mammals having a multitude of meanings, but one that you often connect with them is that the offspring are raised in a womb instead of having eggs laid. But placenta initially started out in eggs before animals started developing offspring within the females only, or for seahorses, male. But they're not mammals, so I don't think they... Wait, yeah, they are. Don't listen to me. Anyway, the point of this all being is not only that museum is really cool, but that evolutionarily speaking, there can be really minute changes with animals. That's why you hear things like, how many different species of ants or insects or something like that there are. There are these little tiny changes that happen that separate them. And it doesn't necessarily only have to be physical either. So I thought that was really cool to actually, get us to see little pinpoints within the evolution of how animals became what they are today and how they are ever changing as well.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Natural history is pretty neat.
Yeah. My friend also brought up an interesting question about how museums are organized. So, and I don't know if you could attest to this at all, or if you'd be like, that's a good point.
Maybe.
So,
we'll see.
Afterwards, we went to the Modern Museum of Art. Or other way around, Museum of Modern Art.
Yeah, there you go.
I got there. So, in a natural history museum, artifacts from like Asia and Native Americans, Central America, um, India, Middle Eastern artifacts, African artifacts, they're all in a natural history museum. But Greek and Roman artifacts are put in art museums. Why is that?
Well, on the surface, without delving too much into the potential of saying that the divide is based upon race.
Well, that's what you want to say, right? Like,
Yeah, but
there's underlying racism.
I would assume that, I mean, life in terms of human history, or starting from an evolutionary standpoint, life began in Africa and Egypt and the kind of Middle East sort of area. But, Africa primarily is where we can pretty much trace all of the evolutionary history of man to. There are pockets in Africa towards the equator, kind of up above the equator, that general area.
Well, I'm saying that even if at the American Natural History Museum, they have like just tapestries, statue, paintings, even stuff like that as a natural history museum. But if you will go across Central Park to the Metropolitan Art Museum, they have the same kind of stuff from ancient Greece and ancient Rome. So my friend brought up the point: what's the difference there? Because it's the same sort of medium, but it was made by a different society.
Yeah, and it could also be the view of art from a purely artistic standpoint, as opposed to more of a form of communication, in where you would have earlier human history. Art wasn't necessarily thought of as it would have been in, say, Greek times or in Roman times, where you had specific artists and they had schools of apprentice artists who would work on pieces, and that was their livelihood. Certainly there's that kind of analogous role in earlier society, but maybe less of a premium perhaps was placed on it, where you have with Grecian and Roman societies, there are politics and philosophy involved, and you have trade system and forms of currency and things like that have kind of more highly evolved into the general overview of life, or how things are appreciated. But you could also boil everything down and just say that it's a bit of mild racism permeating through the cracks of art, and the delineation between art and historic pieces.
Something to think about, for sure. So obviously the Museum of Modern Art doesn't have a whole lot of actual science within it, but there was an exhibit on Yugoslavian brutalism. Don't know if you know what that is.
Somewhat familiar.
So after an earthquake, leveled parts of Yugoslavia, when they were rebuilding it, they had this architectural style now known as brutalism. Basically, the reason they called it that was because a lot of the buildings had these, a lot of geometry to them and not a whole lot of free form. So
very rigid geometry.
Yes, very rigid, square, a lot of 90-degree, 45-degree angles.
Very simplistic materials, lots of concrete, lots of grays and beige.
Not a lot of different levels to them. Like you wouldn't see like something as simple as a windowsill, for example. Like you may see a building that has sort of squares coming off of it that maybe extra space in the room within the building. But this was just very, you know, basic shapes, all made of gray concrete. Brutal. Just look brutal, man.
So metal.
So they had the blueprints um, from when they were designing these buildings. Then they had the model, and then if the building was actually built, they had pictures of how the building turned out. So that was pretty cool to see that process there. Nothing about the construction, just how they turned out. Skipped over that part because that's boring. Who the hell needs to know about that? Obviously now Yugoslavia is a number of countries.
Yeah.
So if you're wondering, like, what does he mean Yugoslavia? That's why, because it was Yugoslavia at the time. Okay.
It was Yugoslavia, and now it's what, like 4 other countries?
Yeah. I don't know what they all are. Probably should have looked that up beforehand.
I read up on some of the internal conflicts within Yugoslavia between the different ethnic groups in the region, and how there's been kind of a resurgence of trying to have a more unified Yugoslavia again. But I don't remember them either.
And the other thing I learned, I found this kind of funny. I don't know if anyone else would. So I have this lanyard that has like bits of The Starry Night by Van Gogh on it.
Sure.
And
Which you also saw from a mild
Shh,
distance.
I'm getting to that. So,
Spoiling things.
you know, when we were talking about where we're gonna go, I was looking at, you know, what cool stuff these museums have. Obviously, this is New York City. They gotta have some pretty nice, you know, decent, famous paintings in them. So when I looked at the Museum of Modern Art, and the very first thing I saw was The Starry Night, and I'm like, wouldn't it be funny? I go there and I have my lanyard, and the real painting it's based off of right next to it. So I went and actually did that. Held my lanyard up above it, took a picture from fairly far away because there's a number of people who did not move at all while I was, from when I entered that gallery to when I left.
Yeah.
So,
Small herd.
you know, I did the best I could. You know, I took my camera focused on the lanyard instead of the painting, which is okay. I got a closer view of the painting, at least as close as I could get.
Yeah.
I thought it was pretty funny. But what I wanted to bring up was that Van Gogh himself did have somewhat of an interest in astronomy and space. Some people argue that the shape in the center of the Starry Night represents somewhat of a galaxy, which had been discovered at the time. I forget by who. But he was a fan of painting nature, being with nature, stuff like that. So if you didn't, a lot of people don't know that, so now they do.
Yeah.
So you're welcome.
Thank you.
Man, I had a lot of fun. I'd go back.
Yeah. There's too much in New York City to see in a single day or day and a half.
Yeah, I'd probably need like 3-4 days minimum.
A few weeks.
Okay.
To get a really good sense of
Let's not be
things.
brash here.
I mean, hey, I've got a lot of vacation time spent up that I could throw around, but
I don't.
you know, that's the benefits of working in academia.
I guess.
Speaking of academia and of astronomy, sort of a tie-in to your Starry Night reference there,
Yes.
I found a pretty quick article about gravitational waves and their generators or events that generate them. As an aside, I was lucky enough to be able to go to a presentation by one of the preeminent researchers into I believe his research is primarily centered around simulating, or the theoretical simulations of events, mergers between black holes and now neutron stars, that they've detected those, a single one of those with the LIGO detectors. He works on simulations to determine the possibility of detection of events by LIGO based on their proposed sensitivity levels of the interferometers that they use. So he's basically responsible for saying, hey, we should see this many events based on our models and what we know or what we think about the dynamics of these black hole mergers. So I was able to attend that, and it was pretty interesting. But then I also happened across an article that was submitted to NASA's Chandra X-ray Observatory site by a researcher, Dr. Eleonora Troja, I believe. And she is speaking about not a official detection of gravitational waves, but a sort of backwards or reverse engineered, reversed scienced understanding of a possible detection from a similar event to that of the GW 170817, which is the famous collision of two neutron stars discovered in exactly a year ago. Well, a year ago from yesterday, on October 16th, 2017. And one of the interesting things that she goes through and speaks about is primarily talking about her process for determining that this event that she had looked at, which that event in question being a gamma ray burst, which are characteristic of kilonovas, hypernovas, supernova. Whenever a star, or in this case, two neutron stars collide, they release an extreme amount of X-ray light, which the Chandra Observatory is set up to detect. And those are known as gamma ray bursts. Generally, when we detect those, they are extremely bright because they are facing or directed toward the Earth. So we are able to see them as the brightest objects in the sky. Now, in this instance, there was a gamma ray burst designated 150101b that had been detected by the Chandra Observatory, albeit it was a weak X-ray signal that quickly faded away over the course of about a month, which usually isn't the case for gamma ray bursts. They last a little bit longer than that, although, well, the gamma ray bursts will last for technically a few seconds, but the light from them, the X-ray light, will stick around for a much longer period of time. So the conclusion from this, of seeing this weaker X-ray light characteristic of a merger of neutron stars as a off-axis gamma ray burst. That means where the gamma ray burst is not directed straight toward Earth, but at an angle away from the plane that the Earth orbits in. So she was able to conclude and understand this gamma ray burst that was seen in 2015, early 2015, as what could be and likely is another merger of neutron stars, the same vein as the merger of neutron stars detected by LIGO, albeit on an off axis with a gamma ray burst. So right now we weren't able to detect that because of the fact that it's a much weaker signal, and we wouldn't be able to say for certain whether that was indicative of a neutron star merger. But with a more advanced or more sensitive LIGO instrument, the detection of events like this could be multiplied significantly. So just a bit of a fun little scientific reverse logic puzzle that a researcher went through and looked back at some data that she had taken in the past and rethought things when a new instrument came online and has now come forward with the idea of how LIGO detectors could be even more valuable to humankind in detecting off-axis gamma ray bursts and verifying those as neutron star mergers. So some interesting applications of science yet again.
It's interesting how, I mean, that's not the only instance of where we can't really determine something, and then we have some sort of new technology that helps to actually find a very common, or in this case, common maybe among astrophysicists, um, theory or hypothesis that couldn't be able to be confirmed until this new technology were available. So, see, it's pretty interesting to know that LIGO has more uses than we initially thought.
Indeed.
All right. Now, the moment that I'm sure everyone has been waiting for, this has been hyped up for 3 weeks now.
Or at least talked about, maybe not hyped up.
Well,
Great
potato,
hype men here, but
potato.
yeah.
So we are finally getting to the long lost letter from Galileo to a friend of his. And I thought this was a perfect time to just kind of tell the story of Galileo versus the church, because it had been going on for quite some time. And it's interesting to see not only how he kind of worked around the church while still having, a lot of other important scientific discoveries, but it was really his belief of the heliocentric model that got him into trouble with the church. And also the fact on a few occasions he kind of insulted them in some of his writings. So I'll
Just mildly.
yeah, I'll get into that stuff. I'm not going to really go into his scientific contributions. This is more just sort of describing his scuffles with the church. I mean, his scientific contributions would take a whole episode. There's quite a few of them, and then you could make a whole tree of where all those contributions eventually ended up from then to today. So,
Yeah.
it's a fairly long story. So, without further ado, focusing on the church battle. So, Galileo, before his first run in the church, had to be born, obviously.
That helps.
Yes. Vincenzo Galilei. There's going to be a lot of Italian names I'm going to butcher here, just so you know. So either correct me or just shut up.
Well, you're Greek. You're practically Italian.
Not the same. Nowhere near the same. Kind of the same, but not really.
Not quite. Same region, Mediterranean, but
Vincenzo Galilei is a famous lutenist, composer, and music theorist. And Giulia Nye Amanati got married in 1562. 2 years later, Galileo was born in Pisa, Italy on February 15th. So, from a very young age, Vincenzo taught Galileo to have a healthy skepticism for established authority, as well as the value of well-measured and quantified experimentation, and that the results to expect from a combination of mathematics and experimentation. And despite all that, when Galileo turned 16, he seriously considered the priesthood and how different history might have been if that had not happened. However, obviously, he did not join the priesthood. Dear old dad urged his son to enroll in the University of Pisa to pursue a medical degree. So, sometimes, not all the time, sometimes dad is right. A year into his education, Galileo accidentally attended a lecture on geometry. I don't know about you, but, if I accidentally attended some kind of lecture like that in geometry, I would do exactly as Galileo did and drop the major I was doing and become a mathematician. Because that is exactly what happened. Galileo went to his father, who had convinced him to study medicine and had tried to keep Galileo away from mathematics because physicians made more money than mathematicians did. So keeping, priority number one there.
Some things don't change.
Well, Vincenzo reluctantly let Galileo switch to studying mathematics and natural philosophy, and the rest is history. Everybody have a good night. No, I'm kidding. So, in 1586, he published a, albeit small book, on the design of a hydrostatic balance that he had invented. And this was the catalyst that brought him to the attention of the scholarly world. So, Galileo also studied what is called disegno, I think is how I say it. That's how I'm going with it, which is a term encompassing fine art. And in 1588, he became an instructor at the Accademia dell'Arti del Disegno in Florence. That's my Italian accent. You're welcome. In 1580, I know, it's great. I've been working on it about a few seconds before I started reading this. In 1589, yeah, right? It's pretty atrocious. So in 1589, he was appointed to the chair of mathematics in the University of Pisa. And in 1592, he moved to the University of Padua, where he taught geometry, mechanics, and astronomy. Now, during this period, Galileo made a lot of significant discoveries in both fundamental sciences, like things like kinematics of motion and astronomy, as well as applied sciences such as things like telescopes, optics. An area he famously wrote near the end of his life, strength of materials. So now we'll get to his first little scuffle with the church. And this is what the most recent discovery that initiated me to, read more about him was concerning. So the long-lost original letter that Galileo first had set down his arguments against the church's doctrine that the sun orbits the earth was discovered, albeit in a misdated library catalog in the Royal Society in London. For those who don't know, the President Council and Fellows of Royal Society of London, more succinctly known as Royal Society in London, is the oldest scientific institution in the world. It's pretty old, John. John B. Wowd.
That it is.
Okay. So the gist of this story is that Galileo wrote this strongly worded letter about how science should be secular. A friar gave that letter to the Inquisition in Rome. Galileo was like, oh shit, so he edited the letter, sent it to a cleric in Rome, and historians were never sure which version was actually version 1.0, if it was that strongly worded letter or the edited letter. So Salvatore Ricciardo, I guess, a postdoctoral science historian at the University of Bergamo in Italy, was spending a month during the summer touring British libraries to study handwritten comments that readers might have left about Galileo's printed works. On August 2nd, he visited the Royal Society Library. After his one-day visit, he idly flicked through the online catalog, looking for anything to do with a one Benedetto Castelli, who was a mathematician at the University of Pisa in Italy during the early 1600s. So this would have been the time that Galileo was teaching at that university shortly before he left. So one entry that had jumped out to Salvatore was, according to the catalog, a letter that Galileo wrote to Castelli, dated the 21st of October, 1613. When he examined it, it appeared to include Galileo's signature, GG, not for Galileo Galilei, not good game, for all you gamers out there.
Unfortunately.
Yes. So it appeared it had his signature on it, but it was actually dated 21st of December 1613 and contained many crossing outs. And he immediately realized that the letter's potential importance and asked for permission to photograph all 7 pages of the letter. So the misdating on this might be one reason why this letter had always been overlooked by Galileo scholars. So the letter was included in an 1840 Royal Society catalog, but also was misdated there as well as 21st December 1618. So the letter had been there for, almost 200 years, and nobody had ever taken a closer look at it. And another reason might be that the Royal Society is really not the go-to place in the UK for those types of historical documents. So its more natural home would have been the British Library, which is a different entity. So historians are now trying to trace just how long that letter had been in the Royal Society Library and how it arrived there. So what they know is that it had been there since at least the mid-18th century, and they found hints in old catalogs that it might have been there a century or earlier than that. Researchers speculate that it might have arrived at the Society thanks to close connections between the Royal Society and the Academy of Experiments in Florence, which was founded in 1657 by Galileo's students, but unfortunately fizzled out within a decade or so after it was founded. So the unearthing and analysis of the 7-page letter exposed critical new details about the saga that led to the astronomer's condemnation for heresy in 1633, which we will get into more in a few moments. So it provided the strongest evidence we have yet that at the start of Galileo's battle with religious authorities, he was actively engaging in damage control and trying to separate and to spread a toned-down version of his claims in that original letter. So Galileo wrote the letter to Castelli on December 21st, 1613, and in it, Galileo set out for the first time his argument that scientific research should be free from theological doctrine. Galileo argued that this scant reference in the Bible to astronomical events should not be taken literally because scribes had simplified these descriptions so that they could be understood by common people. Religious authorities who argued otherwise didn't have the competence to judge. Most crucially, Galileo reasoned that the heliocentric model of Earth orbiting the Sun proposed by famous Polish astronomer Nicholas Copernicus 70 years prior was not actually incompatible with the Bible. So of these 2 versions known to survive, one is now held in the Vatican secret archives. That version was sent to the Inquisition in Rome on February 7, 1615 by a Dominican friar named Niccolo Lorini.
Niccolo Boltra.
Yeah, Niccolo Boltra.
That was his code name.
So historians know that Castelli then returned Galileo's 1613 letter to him, and that on February 16th of 1615, Galileo wrote to his friend Piero Dini, who was a cleric in Rome, suggesting that the version that Lorini had sent the Inquisition might have been doctored. So Galileo enclosed with that letter a less inflammatory version of the first letter, which he asked Dini to pass along to the Vatican theologians who, might have been a little peeved at his first letter.
Just a bit.
So his letter to Dini complains of the wickedness and ignorance of his enemies and lays out his concern that the Inquisition may be in part deceived by this fraud which is going around under the cloak of zeal and charity. So the existence of 2 versions created a lot of confusion among scholars over which corresponded to Galileo's original. So we weren't sure if was that first letter actually doctored and the second one was the original, or is the one that was given to the Vatican the original, and this one he sent to Dini was a fake, or the second version of it, or was marked up by Galileo? So many copies of both versions of the 1613 letter were made, but because the original letter was assumed to be lost, it was never clear whether the incensed clergymen had doctored the letter to strengthen their case for heresy, or whether Galileo wrote the strong version, then decided to soften his own words. So now with this discovery, it seems that the latter is true. The newly unearthed letter is dotted with scorings out, amendments, and handwriting analysis does suggest that Galileo wrote those amendments in it. The scratchings out and amendments, the signed copy discovered by Salvatore shows Galileo's original wording, and it has the same as in the Castelli Lorini copy. So the changes are rather telling, obviously. In one case, Galileo referred to a certain proposition in the Bible as, quote, false if one goes by the literal meaning of the words. So he crossed out the word false and replaced it with look different from the truth. And in another section, Galileo changes reference to the scriptures, quote, concealing its most basic dogmas to a weaker wording of veiling. So Galileo trying to save his behind there. So this was happening in 1615. He was not sentenced to heresy until 1633. So in the meantime, here's the story of what was happening between the letter controversy up to that moment. The year is 1615. Cardinal Bellarmine, which Cardinal Bellarmine wrote that the Copernican system, which places the sun at the center of the solar system and has the planets orbiting the sun in circular orbits, not elliptical. That came later. You can thank Kepler for that. Cardinal Bellarmine wrote, could not be defended without a true physical demonstration that the sun does not circle the earth, but the earth circles the sun. So what Galileo did was he considered this theory of his about tides. His theory of the tides he would use to provide physical proof of the motion of Earth around the sun. So Galileo's theory of tides said that the tides were caused by the sloshing back and forth of water in the seas as a point on the Earth's surface sped up and slowed down because of the Earth's rotation on its axis and revolution around the sun. So basically that the water moves in the ocean because the Earth makes it slosh around, which, I don't know, you may be able to infer this is not how that works.
Not quite.
No.
But it is interesting to see how in antiquity people went about determining these what we consider to be very widely accepted truths. How they went about determining those through logic and inference and observation, primarily, with some math involved, but certainly nothing on the order of getting into elliptical orbits of, Keplerian orbits.
Right. And historians think that, Galileo was committed to this idea because he was committed to the, overall model that the Earth rotates around the sun. So even if this theory is a failure, that he was still, committed to it. His heart was in the right spot. So obviously Galileo's tide theory was incorrect. If it was correct, there would only be one high tide per day. Venice alone had two, but Galileo argued that the two high tides in Venice was an anomaly resulting from secondary causes like the depth of the sea and the shape of the seabed. So while those are factors, that is not an anomaly. They're not secondary factors. They do play an important role in tides. But funny enough, Galileo dismissed Kepler's idea that the moon caused the tides, and Galileo took no interest in another one of Kepler's ideas, that the planets had elliptical orbits. Both we know are true. So, even Galileo was wrong every now and then.
Be surprised how often that's the case with scientific thought.
Oh yeah.
In the
hear,
early days.
We only hear about the correct stuff. It seems like what we got right.
Yep.
Well, as it turns out, the Roman Inquisition didn't care about Galileo's claims about his original letter being doctored by someone within the church. And in February 1616, an inquisitorial commission, which I guess is how you're supposed to say that, declared heliocentrism to be, quote from their decision, foolish and absurd in philosophy and formally heretical, since it explicitly contradicts in many places the sense of Holy Scripture. So they banned Copernicus's book on the heliocentric model. Cardinal Bellarmine was instructed by then Pope Paul V to deliver his findings to Galileo, that Galileo was to abandon completely the opinion that the sun stands still at the center of the world and the earth moves, and henceforth not to hold, teach, or defend it in any way whatever, either orally or in writing. So Galileo was condemned to never address heliocentrism as truth, only as mathematical or philosophical ideas. So for the next decade, Galileo largely abandoned any sort of mention or anything to do with heliocentrism, but that did not stop him from headbutting with the church. Ooh! So in 1619, Galileo became embroiled in another controversy. Father Orazio Grassi, a professor of mathematics at the Jesuit Collegio Romano, getting the Midwestern style pronunciation of these Italian words.
Fantastic, isn't it?
So their dispute began over the nature of comets, but ultimately turned into a wider controversy over the very nature of science itself. So early in 1619, Father Grassi anonymously published an astronomical disputation on the three comets of the year 1618. Now, by the way, the titles of these, not all of them are books, some of them are pamphlets or articles, but they were translated from Italian, and obviously they are written way more formally, because that's just how they wrote things at the time. Anyway, so Grassi's pamphlet discussed the nature of a comet that appeared late in November of the previous year. So Grassi adopted Tycho Brahe's self-titled Tychonic system, which is almost crazier sounding than the geocentric model. So what the Tychonic system says is that the other planets of the solar system orbit around the sun, and the sun in turn orbits around the earth. So he's trying to have his cake and eat it too when it came to geo and heliocentric models. So Grassi referenced this system as being truth, but he also referenced many of Galileo's own observations without mentioning him. And he concluded that the comet was a fiery body that moved along a segment of a great circle at a constant distance from the earth. And since it moved in the sky more slowly than the moon, it must be farther away. So Galileo, in response, wrote an article titled Discorso on Comets that was critical of Grassi's arguments and conclusions. So even though there's a little sort of pettiness going on here. So even though most of the article was written by Galileo and the rest of it written by a Florentine lawyer named Mario Guiducci, he published the article under Guiducci's name. So in
What
its
a
op-
bitch.
yeah. So in its opening passage, they gratuitously insulted the Jesuit Christopher Scheiner, and various uncomplimentary remarks about the professors of the College Romano were scattered throughout the works. So the Jesuits were reasonably, or some people would argue unreasonably, offended by this. Father Grossi, in turn, replied with a polemical tract of his own. The Astronomical and Philosophical Balance was published under the pseudonym Lothario Sarcio Sinenzano, and Grossi purported that Lothario was one of his own pupils, which obviously is complete is a lie.
Bullshit.
He wrote it. So this led Galileo to write one of his most famous and masterful works, the Assayer, which was published much later in 1623. The Assayer is widely considered one of the most, if not the most important book in establishing the scientific method, and was greeted at the time with wide acclaim. It does not address heliocentrism at all, so it's interpreted differently and viewed differently by the church and religious people in Italy. But it was greeted with wide acclaim, and particularly pleased the new pope, Pope Urban VIII. Now, the reason this is important, before he became pope, he was Cardinal Maffeo Barberini, and Barberini was a friend and admirer of Galileo's work, and he disagreed with Galileo's condemnation in 1616. So naturally, after Pope Paul V passed away, Galileo encouraged the election of Barberini to be the new pope. And in August 1623, that did happen, and Cardinal Maffeo Barberini became Pope Urban VIII. So despite his friendship with the new pope, Galileo's dispute with Father Grossi permanently alienated many of the Jesuits who had previously been sympathetic to Galileo's ideas. So Galileo and his friends were convinced that these Jesuits were responsible for bringing about his later condemnation. However, historians cannot confirm or deny this, and it is pure speculation that this was a contributing factor in his condemnation. So during these many years after his condemnation in 1616, Galileo had continued writing a book on the subject of heliocentrism. He had not presented it up until after Pope Urban VIII had received his papacy. So Pope Urban tells Galileo, you can write the book, but only if you present both sides for and against, and you do not advocate for heliocentrism. So Galileo obliges this, and the dialogue concerning the two chief world systems was published in 1632. So Galileo named the character that defended geocentrism Simplicio, which loosely translates to simpleton in English. Well, Galileo did preface that Simplicio is named after a famous Aristotelian philosopher. Pope Urban VIII was having none of that crap, and he felt that Galileo was publicly ridiculing him. Now Galileo has alienated his biggest supporter in the church. And in February of 1633, Galileo's trial began, and on June 22nd, 1633, he was found vehemently suspect of heresy and sentenced to house arrest, where he would remain for the remainder of his life, and all of his books, including future writings, were banned. Now, during his house arrest, Galileo wrote his last famous piece, Discourses and Mathematical Demonstrations relation to two new sciences, these two new sciences being kinematics and strength of materials. Galileo passed away on January 7th, 1942, due to fever and heart palpitations at the ripe old age of 77. And that is the shortened, condensed, grand story of Galileo versus the Church.
So when does the Spanish Inquisition with their comfy chairs and fluffy pillows come in?
I don't know. I wasn't expecting that, so I didn't read anywhere that it happened either.
Well, nobody suspects the Spanish Inquisition.
I see. I see what you did there. I may or may not have set that up.
Yeah, yeah. We're great. Comedy. Fantastic here.
God, what the hell was that? Maybe you couldn't hear it. I don't know.
I didn't hear anything.
Okay, so never mind then. I also would like to take the moment to apologize for those of you who, excuse me, may be hearing car sounds. I do live right up against a rather busy street, and occasionally it gets too loud and my microphone will pick it up. But this is the best place I can record, so sue me. And the other thing is I kind of have a throat thing going on, so my voice is like going in and out this whole hour.
Yeah, I've been strategically turning my microphone off to blow my nose loudly because it's that time of year for colds and generally feeling kind of shitty.
Yay. So
Unfortunately.
I thought about a title, maybe stealing one of these, fancy sounding titles.
Okay.
Like dialogue concerning the two chief world systems of high quality. Something like that.
That seems a bit lengthy.
Discourse on high quality comets.
I mean, it wouldn't be bad. Or
What are the titles? Let's see.
what's do you have those titles in Italian?
Oh, I'd have to look them up. I don't have them written down.
I mean, we could completely butcher things and just be like, Discorsia de qualità. I don't know.
Let me look up. Let's see. I think I actually have Google Translate. Let's see.
If I'm anywhere close to what it actually is, I feel terrible.
We're going to find out shortly here. Yeah, if you can hear my keyboard, sue me.
Clicky keyboards.
English to Italian. All right, what do you want me to type in here?
Discourse on high quality.
Discourse on high quality. Discorso sull'alta qualità.
That's kind of in the realm of things.
I guess I like it. I'll put in parentheses the English title,
That'll work.
even though we really didn't have a discourse about high quality.
Not really. But, hey, you know what?
What if
We're all
discourse on
about-
high quality podcast action?
We're all about
That one's even,
transparency.
that one's even worse.
Or better? Do you mean better, not worse?
Discorso sull'azione, podcast di alta qualità.
That sounds like a great paper that
Oh,
could be
man.
published.
Get on it. All right, I'm taking podcast action out. I'm just leaving it as is.
Maybe a little bit too lengthy with that one.
A lot lengthy. All right, that is all the time we have. Unless you have anything to add.
Nope.
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 You're just gonna
I'll
sit there.
I'll
blowing your
save
nose.
things for next week.
All right. Next week, well, I don't know. Maybe do more politics. Maybe not.
We'll-
Let's see what kind of
We'll
what we
see
feel
if we're
like.
still burnt out on.
I don't know. I almost, whenever I get into politics, I just rant, And
Yeah.
today I actually had like a whole bunch of stuff prepared, and it took up, most of the time.
I don't know. Maybe we'll see about switching our focus from just reporting on the political climate to with the air of the election coming up. Maybe we should switch our focus to change and how best to navigate the political climate as it stands right now and affect change within that political climate given the powers of the people,
Ignore
although they may seem.
polls. Right?
We'll see. Play around with the idea.
Okay. And with that, this has been High Quality Podcast Action.
I'm John.
I'm Nick. And you have a very high quality week. Peace.
See ya.